The sun hung low over the jagged cliffs of the American Southwest, casting long golden shadows across the rocky desert floor. The air was dry and carried the faint, sharp scent of sagebrush. Alone on the winding trail, Eleanor adjusted the strap of her backpack and squinted at the horizon, her boots crunching over the loose gravel. She had always been drawn to the wilderness, the way it demanded respect and solitude, the way it offered freedom from the constant hum of the city. But today, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, subtle but unmistakable, as though the landscape itself was holding its breath. Her eyes caught a flicker of movement near the base of a steep canyon wall. At first, she thought it was a trick of the sunlight, but curiosity pulled her closer. There, hidden beneath the jagged overhang of rocks, she noticed the shadowed mouth of a cave, almost perfectly camouflaged against the ochre cliffs. Something about it called to her an instinctive tug, equal parts dread and fascination. She had hiked these trails countless times, yet she had never seen this cave before. The entrance was narrow, forcing her to crouch low as she stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, a stark contrast to the blazing heat outside. Her footsteps echoed softly, mingling with the faint sound of dripping water somewhere deeper in the darkness. Eleanor's heart began to race, a mix of adrenaline and apprehension. She instinctively reached for the flashlight in her pack, clicking it on to reveal rough, uneven walls streaked with mineral stains. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a cavern that stretched farther than she could see. Then movement. A faint rustling sound came from the far end of the cave, followed by a soft, strained groan. Eleanor froze, holding her breath. She wasn't alone. Fear surged, sharp and primal, yet beneath it was an undeniable curiosity. Step by cautious step, she advanced. Keeping the flashlight steady. As the beam reached the source of the noise, Eleanor gasped. There, bound with crude ropes and slumped against the cave wall, was a man unlike anyone she had ever seen. His skin was weathered and tanned, and his dark eyes glimmered with pain and defiance. The man's clothing was tattered, a mixture of traditional Apache adornments and pieces of what might have been scavenged from the outside world. The ropes cut into his wrists, and bruises streaked his arms and torso. He looked up at her with a mixture of fear, suspicion, and something else she couldn't quite place hope, perhaps that she might help him. Eleanor's mind raced. Who had done this? Why was he here, bound and alone? She felt the weight of the situation settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just an injured hiker or lost traveler. There was a story here, a history she could sense in the sharp intelligence in his eyes and the tense set of his shoulders. She could see the resilience in him, even in his weakened state, and she knew instinctively that this man had survived, far worse than she could imagine. Her training as a wilderness guide and medic kicked in, but she forced herself to slow down. The wrong move, the wrong word, could provoke him or whoever might have left him here. She knelt a few feet away, keeping her flashlight steady, and spoke softly. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said. Her voice echoed slightly in the cavern, but it carried a note of sincerity. The man's gaze flicked toward her, assessing, calculating. He didn't speak at first, only watched. Eleanor realized that this moment was fragile. Trust, however small, had to be earned. She reached into her pack and pulled out a water bottle, placing it near him without moving too close. The gesture was simple, yet deliberate, a sign that she offered care, not threat. For a long moment, time seemed to stretch. The cave, the silence, the golden light from the entrance, everything seemed suspended. Eleanor could feel her pulse in her ears as she waited, breath held, for any reaction. Then, slowly, the man's eyes softened, and a slight nod acknowledged her presence. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it marked the beginning of something neither of them could yet understand. the start of a connection that would challenge both their worlds. In that shadowed cave, amidst the smell of dust and sweat, Eleanor realized that her solitary hike had led her to a moment far greater than any adventure she had imagined. She had discovered not just a hidden cave in the desert, but a hidden story, a life in need of rescue, and a path toward an unimaginable bond. The cave seemed to hold its breath, shadows stretching like dark fingers across the jagged walls. Eleanor's pulse thumped in her ears as she knelt a cautious distance from the bound man, her flashlight flicking over his tense form. Every instinct screamed caution. She knew the desert could be unforgiving, and humans, especially ones she didn't know, could be even more dangerous. Yet beneath her fear, curiosity simmered, insistent and irresistible. He remained still, muscles coiled as if ready to spring, eyes dark and watchful. Eleanor noted the way he shifted slightly, the faint scars along his forearms, the intricate patterns woven into his clothing, remnants of a life she could only guess at. There was something undeniably powerful about him, even in his weakened state, and she realized that fear wasn't just hers. He was afraid too, not of her, not entirely, but of the unknown, the vulnerability forced upon him by the ropes that cut into his skin. Her mind raced, weighing every option. She could retreat, leave him bound, and face the moral consequences later. Or she could act, risking her safety to help someone who, by all appearances, might have been a stranger and perhaps a threat. Eleanor's fingers grazed the edge of her backpack, brushing against the small first aid kit she always carried. It was a symbol of preparedness, yet it also reminded her that care came with responsibility. Slowly, carefully, she spoke again, her voice low and steady. "I'm here to help. I won't hurt you." She let a pause linger, giving the man a chance to process, to choose whether to believe her. Her words felt inadequate, thin against the weight of the silence that stretched between them. His eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle flicker of skepticism. Eleanor noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed against the ropes. She could feel his wariness radiating like heat, a silent warning. Trust must be earned. And yet, beneath it all, there was something else, a spark of hope, fragile and cautious, that maybe she could be more than just another danger. Curiosity got the better of her. She let her gaze travel over the man, noticing the small details that spoke of his story. The rope burns suggested days, perhaps weeks of captivity. Dirt and blood caked into his clothes told of harsh terrain and desperate struggle. There was a story here, one she wanted to understand, one that seemed impossible to ignore. Eleanor realized she was no longer just a hiker in the desert. She had become a witness to survival, a participant in something far larger than herself. Still, fear was a shadow she could not shake. She thought of the countless scenarios where her good intentions could lead to disaster. A sudden movement could provoke him. A misstep could trigger panic, and help could quickly turn into harm. She inched backward slightly, forcing herself to breathe, to calm the pounding in her chest. Survival wasn't just about courage. It was about patience, observation, and the careful dance between risk and trust. The man shifted slightly, eyes locking with hers in a silent exchange. He wasn't making any sudden movements, but the tension was palpable, electric. Eleanor sensed that, for all his strength, he was evaluating her, measuring intentions, testing boundaries. It was a delicate balance, a game without words, where the stakes were life, injury, or perhaps the fragile birth of trust. Eleanor extended a small gesture, placing a water bottle closer to him without stepping forward. She didn't speak, letting the object act as a bridge between their worlds. His gaze flicked to it, hesitating, then back to her. It was a simple act, but it carried meaning, acknowledgement, patience, and the promise of care. Time seemed to stretch. Shadows danced along the walls as the sun outside dipped lower, painting the cave in muted shades of amber. Eleanor's fear ebbed slightly, replaced by a cautious fascination. Who was this man? How had he ended up here, bound and alone? And most importantly, what would happen if she chose to reach out to cross the invisible line between fear and trust? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man's body relaxed fractionally, just enough for Eleanor to notice. It was a subtle signal, a fragile thread of connection forming between two strangers in the desert's heart. Curiosity, tempered by fear, had begun to bridge the chasm between them. She realized that helping him wouldn't just be an act of courage, it would be an act of discovery, of understanding, and of forging a bond neither of them could yet fully comprehend. In that shadowed cave, Eleanor felt the delicate thrill of possibility, the fear of the unknown intertwined with the magnetic pull of curiosity. She had found not just a man in need, but a story waiting to be unraveled, a life waiting to intersect with hers in ways that could reshape both their worlds. The cave was quiet, save for the soft echo of Eleanor's breath and the faint drip of water somewhere deeper in the shadows. The tension between her and the bound man hung thick, almost tangible, like the heat of the desert clinging to her skin outside. Fear still hummed in her veins, but beneath it, a stronger, more insistent feeling took hold. Resolve. She couldn't leave him here, chained and wounded, no matter the risks. Slowly, she moved closer, keeping her flashlight trained on him. Every step was deliberate, careful not to startle him. She could see the cuts and bruises now, fresh and angry against his weathered skin. The ropes were crude but unyielding, digging into his wrists and shoulders, forcing him into a slouched, almost defeated posture. Eleanor's chest tightened. Whoever had done this had wanted to subdue him completely, strip him of power and choice. "Easy," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to help." His eyes flicked toward her, wary, sharp. The tension in his muscles remained, but there was a slight easing in his posture, tiny, almost imperceptible. Eleanor knew that trust would not come quickly. It never did in situations like this. She had to be patient, deliberate, careful. She knelt a short distance away and pulled out a small utility knife from her backpack, testing its blade with a quiet click. Her hands were steady, practiced. She studied the knots binding him, recognizing their simplicity yet acknowledging the danger in moving too quickly. One wrong motion and the rope could tighten, cutting deeper into his skin or worse, provoke a sudden, defensive reaction. "Look at me," she said gently, raising her voice just enough for him to hear clearly. "I'm going to free you. But you have to stay calm. Can you do that?" For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, after a tense heartbeat, he gave a slight nod, cautious, measured. Eleanor exhaled quietly enough for relief to soften her shoulders, but not enough to let her guard down. She began cutting the rope slowly, carefully sliding the knife under the fibers without making abrupt movements. The man flinched with each whisper of resistance but stayed still, his dark eyes never leaving hers. Eleanor could feel the pulse of his fear and his awareness, a constant reminder that this act was delicate, dangerous, and profoundly intimate. As the last rope fell away with a soft snap, he flexed his wrists tentatively, testing freedom for the first time in who knew how long. Eleanor handed him the water bottle again, and this time he drank, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the small gesture of kindness. She could see the tension easing from his jaw, the slight relaxation of shoulders that had been taut for days, perhaps weeks. "You're safe now," she said softly, letting her words hang in the damp cave air. "You're not alone." The man's eyes met hers, a flicker of something raw and unspoken passing between them, gratitude, suspicion, and maybe, just maybe, the fragile stirrings of trust. Eleanor knew the journey had only begun. Healing didn't stop at the removal of ropes. It was physical, yes, but also mental, emotional. and profoundly human. For a long moment, they simply sat there, separated by a cautious distance yet connected by circumstance. Outside, the sun dipped lower, slanting golden light into the cave's mouth, painting them in warmth that contrasted with the shadows around them. Eleanor's thoughts drifted briefly to what lay ahead, getting him somewhere safe, tending to his injuries, earning his confidence, understanding his story. But for now, the focus was simple: presence, patience, and care. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and cautious, rough with disuse. "Why?" Eleanor tilted her head, offering a small, wry smile that was more nervous than confident. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said. No other explanation felt necessary. She could sense that, even in his guarded state, he understood the honesty in her words. He shifted, flexing his hands and shoulders, testing their freedom. Eleanor watched carefully, ready to react if needed. But he remained still, the muscles of his body beginning to ease, the rigid posture of a prisoner slowly giving way to the awareness of autonomy. In that shadowed cave, a bond had begun to form, not fully realized, not yet named, but undeniable. Eleanor had crossed a threshold of fear and uncertainty, and the man, in turn, had allowed the first crack in his walls. Together, they had taken the first step towards something neither of them could have anticipated, a fragile, tentative, yet undeniable connection between two strangers thrown together by circumstance, survival, and choice. For the first time since he had been bound, the man looked at Eleanor not as an intruder, not as a threat, but as someone who had given him back a piece of himself he had thought lost forever. And in that moment, Eleanor knew that the real challenge, the real adventure, was just beginning. Cave had grown quieter after the tense hours of freeing him from his bonds. Shadows stretched long across the jagged walls, flickering with the last rays of the desert sun. Eleanor and the man, still a stranger in every sense, sat in a delicate silence. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Words seemed inadequate for the gravity of what had just happened. The air was heavy with the weight of survival, trust, and the unspoken acknowledgement that something irreversible had begun between them. Eleanor studied him quietly. He was tall and wiry, with muscles honed by years of hard living, yet his movements still carried the fatigue and stiffness of captivity. His dark eyes, sharp and observant, followed her every motion, yet there was a vulnerability now, subtle but undeniable. He was no longer a threat, but neither was he fully at ease. That would take time, hours, days, maybe longer. But Eleanor felt a spark of connection, fragile and delicate, that begged for recognition. It was then that a thought struck her. He had no name here. She didn't know it, and if he had ever shared it, those words had likely been lost to the desert's memory, buried beneath the trauma of his capture. Names were powerful anchors to identity, to history, to belonging. Without one, he was a shadow of a man, a figure suspended between worlds. "Do you have a name?" Eleanor asked softly, keeping her tone calm, gentle, careful. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked to hers, wary, cautious, like a wild animal sizing up a hand extended in peace. Eleanor could see the hesitation, the internal debate. Trust this stranger enough to share, or remain silent and guarded as he had been for so long? Minutes passed in silence, the only sound the soft drip of water echoing in the cave. Finally, he shook his head, almost imperceptibly. "No," he said, his voice low and hoarse, a whisper that seemed both reluctant and resigned. Eleanor nodded slowly, considering her options. She could let it go, respect his choice, and wait for him to reveal it. But something in her heart told her that this was a moment for action, for giving him something he had lost, a claim to identity, a tether to freedom and humanity. "What if I gave you one?" she asked, her voice tentative but hopeful. Something that belongs to you? Something new? He raised an eyebrow, curious to spite himself, the faintest trace of intrigue flickering across his guarded features. Eleanor thought carefully, searching for a name that carried meaning, power, and hope. Her mind drifted to the desert outside, the golden sunsets, the vast skies, and the fire that still burned within him despite everything he had endured. Rising sun, she said finally, the words resonating softly in the cave. It's a name for someone who has survived, someone who is starting again. A new day, a new beginning. The man stared at her, his expression unreadable at first. Then, slowly, the tension in his face softened, just slightly. The corners of his mouth twitched, hinting at the shadow of a smile. Rising sun, he repeated, testing the syllables, tasting them on his tongue. The sound seemed foreign, yet somehow fitting, like a piece of himself he had forgotten was missing. Yes, Eleanor said, warmth creeping into her voice. That's you. Rising sun. For the first time, he seemed to relax in a profound way. The name was more than just a word. It was acknowledgement, recognition, and promise all in one. It spoke to who he was, to what he had endured, and to the hope that he could move forward, unbound not just physically but emotionally. The cave felt lighter after that. Shadows remained, but they seemed less oppressive, less suffocating. Outside, the last rays of sun dipped behind the canyon walls, painting the desert in fiery golds and deep purples. Rising sun sat silently, absorbing the sound of his new identity, the weight of it settling around him like a mantle. Eleanor watched him closely. She understood that a name alone would not heal all wounds, nor would it erase the trauma etched into his body and mind. But it was a start, a small vital step toward reclaiming himself, toward finding a place in a world that had seemed cruel and unforgiving. Rising sun, she said again, softly, almost as a promise. You belong. Here and anywhere you choose to go from now on. He looked at her, and for the first time, there was no fear, only a quiet, cautious acceptance. The ropes were gone, the cave was silent, and a name had been given. It was a small gesture, but monumental in its significance. In that moment, a new chapter began not just for Rising Sun, but for both of them, as two lives now intertwined by fate, compassion, and the fragile magic of trust. The desert outside the cave had transformed with the setting sun, bathing the jagged cliffs in hues of gold, amber, and fire. Eleanor and Rising Sun stepped out together, the cool evening breeze carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. For the first time, he moved freely, unbound by ropes, unshackled by fear, or at least slightly less so. Yet the world beyond the cave was vast, unforgiving, and unfamiliar. And Eleanor knew the next step was crucial. They needed a safe space, a home. Her cabin was modest but sturdy, perched on a rocky plateau overlooking the valley below. It had withstood years of desert storms and offered shelter from both sun and wind. She led Rising Sun along the rough path, mindful of each step and the delicate trust between them. He walked with quiet attention, eyes scanning the landscape, muscles taut from years of survival instincts. Every gesture, every glance, seemed to measure his new reality, freedom coupled with unfamiliar human kindness. When they reached the cabin, Eleanor pushed open the heavy wooden door, letting in the last streaks of sunlight. The interior smelled of wood polish, herbs, and the faint trace of fire from the hearth. She motioned for him to enter, and for a moment he paused at the threshold. The concept of home was foreign walls, furniture, the comforting clutter of lived-in space. But slowly he stepped inside, taking in the warmth and the security of a place that was his to inhabit, if only temporarily. Rest, Eleanor said softly. You've earned it. Rising Sun sank onto a worn rug near the hearth, the weight of exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. Eleanor went to her kitchen area, preparing a simple meal of bread, roasted vegetables, and water. She worked quietly, allowing him space, while occasionally glancing at him. He watched her too, cautious but curious, the tension in his body slowly easing. The act of preparing food, of sharing sustenance, was the first bridge between their worlds. After eating, she showed him the cabin's modest amenities, a small bed for sleeping, blankets, and supplies for tending wounds. Each gesture was deliberate, a silent reassurance that he was not alone. Rising Sun observed everything with a quiet intensity, learning the rhythms of her home as if it were a foreign language he needed to understand. Days passed, each one marked by small routines that wove trust and familiarity between them. Eleanor tended to his physical injuries with careful hands, cleaning abrasions and binding them gently. She watched him regain strength, his movements growing more fluid, more natural. Rising Sun, in turn, offered skills from his life as an Apache warrior. He taught her how to read the desert terrain, track animals, and find water in hidden places. There was a rhythm to their coexistence, a delicate balance of giving and receiving, learning and teaching. Evenings were quieter, spent in shared silence or tentative conversation. Rising Sun would sit near the fire, polishing his tools or weaving small items from leather and string, while Eleanor read aloud from books she kept in her cabin. Words bridged gaps that silence could not, and slowly the walls around Rising Sun's heart began to soften. The cabin, once just a shelter, became a sanctuary, a place where he could reclaim both body and spirit. Yet home was more than bricks, wood, and hearth. It was trust, routine, and care. Eleanor understood that every shared meal, every gentle gesture, every moment of quiet companionship was laying the foundation for something more enduring. Rising Sun began to relax into this new existence, learning the rhythm of safety, the patterns of domestic life, and the subtle comfort of belonging. One evening, as the sun sank behind the cliffs, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, Eleanor found Rising Sun sitting outside, gazing at the horizon. "Do you like it here?" she asked gently. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he inhaled deeply, letting the warm desert breeze brush across his face. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "It is safe," he said. "For the first time in a long time, it feels like I can breathe." Eleanor smiled softly, understanding the weight behind those words. Home was not just a structure. It was freedom, refuge, and a place to heal. And here, in the quiet desert plateau, Rising Sun had all three. As night fell and stars blanketed the sky, the cabin glowed warmly against the dark cliffs. Inside, the two of them sat by the fire, a fragile but growing sense of peace surrounding them. They had built more than a shelter. They had begun creating a home, one where trust, care, and newfound kinship could thrive. And in that shared space, the next chapter of their journey together was quietly, irrevocably beginning. The mornings in the desert cabin carried a quiet magic. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the wooden walls, casting long golden stripes across the floor. Rising Sun had grown accustomed to this rhythm, the predictability of warmth, light, and safety. Yet the world beyond the cabin remained vast and untamed, a reflection of the life he had once known, a life shaped by the land, its creatures, and the traditions passed down through generations. Eleanor watched him one morning as he sat, cross-legged near the small fire pit outside. In his hands were strips of leather, delicate tools, and feathers. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as he braided, carved, and wove the materials into small artifacts. There was a story in every motion, a memory etched into every careful knot and twist. Eleanor realized that this was more than craftsmanship, it was culture. Identity and resilience manifested physically. "Can you teach me?" she asked tentatively, unsure of her place in this sacred process. Rising Sun's eyes flicked up, meeting hers with a mixture of caution and curiosity. There was no immediate answer, only a measured silence. Then, slowly, he nodded. It was an invitation not just to learn a skill, but to witness, to participate in a heritage that was deeply personal, profoundly lived. Over the following days, he began teaching her the ways of his people. He showed her how to track animals across the desert floor, reading the subtle disturbances in sand and stone as if they were letters written by the land itself. He taught her how to start a fire using friction, the careful placement of kindling, the patience required to coax warmth from bare earth. With each lesson, Eleanor felt herself stepping into a world that was at once harsh and breathtakingly beautiful, a landscape of knowledge forged through centuries of survival and respect for the natural world. But it wasn't just skills he shared, it was stories, songs, and the philosophy of his people. Around the fire at night, Rising Sun would speak of the sun, the wind, and the spirits of the land, his words painting pictures more vivid than any sunset. He told her of ancestors who had roamed these deserts long before modern maps claimed ownership, of the balance between taking and giving, of the sacred responsibility to protect life. Eleanor listened, enraptured, absorbing lessons that were practical, spiritual, and deeply human all at once. Through this exchange, a new connection began to form, one that transcended fear and survival. Rising Sun had been cautious, protective of his past, wary of intrusion. But Eleanor's patience, respect, and genuine curiosity began to bridge that distance. He saw in her not just a helper or a caretaker, but someone willing to honor his world, to learn without judgment, to witness without imposing. Likewise, Eleanor began sharing parts of her own life. She told him of cities teeming with people, of bustling markets and towering buildings, of conveniences and struggles foreign to him. Their conversations became a dance, a give and take of two vastly different worlds finding common ground. It wasn't always easy. Cultural differences sparked moments of tension, misunderstanding, or quiet reflection. Yet every exchange strengthened their bond, teaching patience, empathy, and the shared human experience of adaptation. One afternoon, as the wind swept dust across the plateau, Rising Sun led Eleanor to a nearby canyon, pointing out edible plants, hidden water sources, and subtle markers of animal movement. He moved with a grace and certainty that spoke of decades attuned to the land, while Eleanor mirrored his movements as best she could, fumbling at times, yet always learning. When she stumbled, he would steady her with a hand on her shoulder, not as a gesture of dominance, but as one of guidance and trust. Evenings were filled with ritual and reflection. They would sit outside the cabin, watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues. Rising Sun would share a song or a chant, and Eleanor would listen, learning the cadence, the stories embedded in the melodies, the subtle wisdom carried in every word. These were moments of intimacy, of cultural exchange, of understanding that extended beyond language. By the time the stars blanketed the sky, Eleanor realized that something profound had happened. The cabin was no longer just a home, it was a crossroads of worlds. Rising Sun's heritage, once confined to memories and survival instincts, was being shared, preserved, and honored. And Eleanor, in turn, was no longer just a solitary caretaker. She had become a student, a companion, and a witness to the enduring strength of a culture that refused to be erased. In the quiet of the desert nights, as the fire crackled and shadows danced across the walls of their shared sanctuary, a bond rooted in mutual respect, knowledge, and understanding had taken hold. They were no longer just rescuer and rescued. They were partners in a journey that stretched across worlds, a bridge between past and present, tradition and modernity. And in that connection lay the promise of something lasting, a foundation upon which trust, friendship, and The desert plateau had grown quieter over the weeks, almost deceptively so. Rising sun had found rhythm and solace in Eleanor's cabin, the routines of daily life stitching a fragile sense of safety back into his world. Yet the wilderness beyond the plateau remained unpredictable, and the outside world, a world neither of them fully understood, loomed like a shadow just beyond the horizon. It began with small signs, footprints near the edge of the plateau that didn't belong to either of them, the distant hum of engines echoing through the canyons, the sharp crackle of voices carried by the wind. Eleanor noticed them first, her instincts as a guide alert to even the slightest disruption. She felt a chill run down her spine, a warning that the sanctuary they had built might be vulnerable. Rising sun, ever attuned to danger, didn't need her observations. He moved with quiet efficiency, scanning the ridges, listening to the wind, noting every subtle change in the landscape. The man who had once been a captive now stood as protector, his instincts honed by a lifetime of survival. Yet even he could not fully anticipate the reach of the outside world. One afternoon, as Eleanor worked near the cabin clearing brush, voices carried down from the canyon below. Two men appeared at the far edge of the plateau, silhouetted against the blazing sunlight. They wore civilian clothes but carried the unmistakable air of authority or perhaps greed. Their eyes swept the cabin, lingering on Rising Sun as if sizing him up, labeling him an intruder, a threat, or a curiosity to exploit. Eleanor's heart pounded. "Rising Sun," she called softly, crouching behind a boulder. "They're here." "Stay calm." He didn't move at first, calculating, analyzing. Then, like a coiled spring, he adjusted his stance, positioning himself between Eleanor and the approaching men. Every muscle in his body tensed, yet his eyes held a steady calm, controlled, deliberate, ready. He wasn't just a man. He was a guardian, someone who had survived captivity and emerged stronger, prepared to defend the fragile sanctuary they had built together. The men called out, their voices sharp, questioning, probing. "Hey, step away from the cabin. We've got business here." Rising Sun remained silent, letting Eleanor speak first. "This is private property," she said firmly, her voice carrying a mixture of defiance and authority. "Leave now, or we'll call the authorities." The strangers laughed, a low, derisive sound. They didn't recognize the bond between the two of them, the trust, the shared history, the survival instinct that neither of them could afford to ignore. They saw only a man who didn't belong, a woman alone with him, and an opportunity to assert dominance or worse, exploit. The tension escalated quickly. One of the men reached into his pocket, hinting at a weapon. Eleanor's pulse raced, fear and resolve clashing. Rising Sun's hand hovered near his own, a subtle warning. In that frozen moment, time seemed to stretch, the desert held its breath. The sun's rays cutting sharp lines across the plateau, shadows dancing like silent witnesses. Then, in a controlled but commanding voice, Rising Sun spoke, his words low but unmistakably authoritative. "Leave now, or you will regret it." The strangers paused, their laughter faltering as they registered the strength and confidence behind his words. Rising Sun wasn't just a man. He was a force of survival, tempered by respect for life but unyielding when threatened. Eleanor watched in awe as he shifted subtly, positioning himself between her and the intruders, eyes fixed, muscles coiled yet ready to act with precision. After a tense standoff, the men retreated, muttering threats and curses, leaving dust clouds swirling behind them as they descended the canyon. Eleanor exhaled, relief washing over her like a sudden storm breaking through heat. She glanced at Rising Sun, noting the calm steadiness that had never wavered, even as danger approached. "That was close," she murmured, her voice a mixture of awe and residual fear. He nodded, eyes still scanning the horizon. "The outside world will not always respect our sanctuary," he said quietly. We must be ready." That night, the fire burned brighter in the cabin. They reinforced windows, checked the perimeter, and shared a quiet meal, the weight of the encounter settling between them. It was a reminder. Trust and home were fragile, and even in the desert, danger could find them. Yet it was also a moment of reaffirmation. Together, they had faced the threat and emerged intact, their bond stronger for the trial and the quiet that followed. Eleanor realized something profound. Rising Sun was no longer just a survivor of captivity. He was a protector, a teacher, a partner in every sense. And together, they had created a home not just of walls and roof, but of courage, trust, and shared vigilance. The desert outside remained vast and untamed, but inside the cabin, two lives intertwined stood ready stronger, wiser and unbroken. And they both knew that whatever threats came next, they would face them together. The desert had grown quiet once more, but the peace felt earned, hard won. Rising Sun moved with ease across the plateau, no longer weighed down by chains, fear, or uncertainty. Each step was deliberate, confident, a man fully present in the world he had reclaimed. Eleanor watched him from the cabin doorway, the fading sun painting the desert in molten gold, and she felt a deep, unspoken gratitude for the trust he had placed in her, for the life they had built together, and for the journey that had begun in the shadowed cave weeks before. Rising Sun had not just regained his freedom. He had discovered something far more profound: belonging. The cabin, once simply a shelter, had become a home not just for the body, but for the spirit. And in Eleanor, he had found a companion who honored his past, embraced his presence, and walked beside him into the uncertain future. Together they had navigated fear, danger, and the unknown, and emerged stronger for it. That morning, the two of them sat outside, sharing a quiet breakfast by the fire. Rising Sun's hands moved with practiced skill, braiding leather strips into simple yet elegant tools. Eleanor watched, sipping her coffee, and marveled at the harmony between him and the desert, his movements reflecting a life lived in tune with the land. But even in the simplicity of the moment, there was complexity, a bond forged through trials, laughter, shared labor, and quiet understanding. "You're different now," Eleanor said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Rising Sun looked up, his dark eyes reflecting the brilliance of the sun rising behind the cliffs. "I am," he admitted. "Not just free from the ropes, but free in a way I didn't think was possible anymore," Eleanor smiled. "And you didn't have to do it alone." He studied her, a flicker of something tender passing across his features. Trust, gratitude, and something deeper, perhaps the beginnings of family, shone in his gaze. The journey that had begun with fear, suspicion, and the struggle to survive had transformed into something remarkable: a partnership, a shared life, a mutual commitment to protect, honor, and nurture one another. As the day unfolded, they worked side by side, tending to the cabin, the land, and the animals that had begun to roam near their home. Every task, no matter how mundane, was an affirmation of their new life together. Rising Sun taught Eleanor to read the desert sky, predicting weather with subtle cues, while she shared her knowledge of plants, cooking, and the small conveniences of modern life. Their worlds, once so separate, had intertwined seamlessly, each enriching the other. Evenings became rituals of reflection and companionship. Around the fire, Rising Sun would share stories of his ancestors, of the spirits of the land, and of lessons learned from survival in its harshest corners. Eleanor listened, absorbing the wisdom that flowed through generations, feeling a deep connection not only to Rising Sun but to the heritage he carried. And sometimes she shared her own stories of cities, people, and lives that existed far beyond the desert plateau. In those exchanges they discovered understanding, empathy, and joy, a reminder that family was more than blood, more than history. It was shared experience, respect, and love. One night, as stars blanketed the sky and the desert settled into quiet, Rising Sun and Eleanor stood at the edge of the plateau, looking out over the land that had shaped him and now, in part, shaped them both. He reached for her hand, and she took it, feeling the warmth and the strength in the gesture. "This is home," he said, voice low but firm, resonating with certainty. "Not just the cabin, not just the land, but this." "U.S.," Eleanor nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "We made it together," she whispered. The wind carried their words across the canyon, merging with the whispers of the desert. In that moment, Rising Sun was not a prisoner, not a stranger, not merely a survivor. He was fully himself, whole, unbound, and embraced by a life that honored both his past and his present. And Eleanor, having walked beside him through fear, uncertainty, and wonder, had become more than a rescuer. She was family, companion, and partner in every sense of the word. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a vast expanse of possibility and promise. And within their shared cabin, amidst the warmth of fire and trust, a new chapter had begun. One of freedom, love, and the quiet certainty that home was not simply a place, it was the people with whom you choose to build it. As the stars shimmered overhead and the night settled over the cliffs, Rising Sun and Eleanor sat together, bound not by chains but by loyalty, trust, and the unbreakable ties of chosen family. The journey that had begun in fear and uncertainty had ended not in isolation but in connection, proving that even in the